Hello, I'm Dr. Katie Ailes from I'm Loud Productions, and in today's workshop, I'm going to teach you how to write a sestina. Sestinas are 39-line long poems which originated in 13th century France, and they rely on a pattern of repeating endwords. They can be pretty complicated and tricky to write, but they are incredibly rewarding when you get them right. So today, I'm going to talk you through how to do it, we're going to do it together, and we're going to have fun. Just like the rest of my Return to Form workshops, there are two different ways that you can watch this video. The first one is to take all of the steps in the workshop and write a poem along with me. If you're doing this technique, anytime you get to a screen with a step on it, like this, just hit pause on the video, do whatever it says on the step, and then hit play again when you're ready to resume the workshop. The other way of doing this is you could just watch this video all the way through without pausing. That'll give you a sense of how sestinas work and give you a sense of what you need to do to write one yourself. Then you can try it out later in your own time. Do whichever technique works best for you. All you need for this workshop is something to write with and something to write on. I'm going to be showing you in my examples using pen and paper, but if you'd prefer to use a computer or a tablet or even your phone, that is totally fine. Just use whatever materials you're most comfortable with. This workshop and our entire Return to Form series is supported by the National Lottery through Creative Scotland. To see all of the videos in this series and the rest of the work on our channel, please subscribe to the channel below and don't forget to like and share this video if you enjoy it. All right, here we go. The first sestina that historians know about was penned around the year 1200 by a troubadour named Amo Daniel, who lived in what is now southwestern France. Over time, poets in other parts of Europe began using this form in their own languages, and the first sestinas in English began to appear around the 1400s. As this poetic form has been transmitted across different cultures, languages, and eras, its formal structure has evolved quite significantly. But the one thing that stayed constant is its most fundamental aspect, which is its use of repeating sets of endwords in a specific pattern. To show you how these endwords work in a sestina, I'm going to show you an example from our Return to Form video on the sestina, which you can watch just up there. What we did is we gave Paul Case and Gray Crosby the same set of endwords, asked them to use at least 3 out of those 6 and write a sestina using them. And they ended up coming up with totally different, but both absolutely stunning poems. So definitely check out that full video. I'm going to show you in my example using Paul Case's poem Terminus. So let's start by looking at the first stanza. The endwords are highlighted, so we have rings, rights, mean, no, our, and point. Then, when we bring up the next stanza, we see that Paul has used those same ending words, but in a different order. So now we have point, rings, our, right, no, and means. And you may have noticed that some of the words are slightly different. Like no spelled K-N-O-W and no spelled N-O. And this is a great technique for writing sestinas that I'm going to go over later in this workshop. The order that these endwords are repeated in follows a set structure. All sestinas use the same pattern for these endwords. So here we've allocated a number to each of the endwords in the first stanza. Rings is 1, rights is 2, mean is 3, etc. The next stanza has to follow the order 6, 1, 5, 2, 4, 3. So the endwords of the second stanza have to be point, rings, our, right, no, means. Then the next stanza has its own different set pattern, and the next, and the next. All contemporary sestinas follow these patterns, and in this workshop I'm going to make it easy for you to follow as well. You can also see here that the end word of the last line in a stanza is always the end word of the first line in the next stanza. For example, in Paul's poem, the last line of the first stanza ends in point, so that is also the end word of the first line of the second stanza. Finally, you can see at the end here that the final stanza is only 3 lines long, not 6. And this final stanza of a sestina has a special name. It's called the envoy. All 6 of the end words are used in that final stanza. 3 of them are the ending words, like in the other stanzas, and the other 3 are in the middle of the lines. As the Sestina form has evolved over time, there have been multiple sets of rules for what order the words should appear in this final envoy. In this workshop, I'm just going to show you one of those options, one of the more common ones. I know that is a lot of numbers and patterns, and if you're anything like me, you didn't get into poetry to do math, but I promise that in this workshop, I'm going to break it down and make it really, really easy to follow that pattern. Plus, as complicated as all of that might sound, using the end words in those set patterns is the only requirement of writing a sestina. There are no set restrictions on content, on rhyme, on any of the other poetic devices. The heart of a sestina, the fundamental aspect of it, is these end words. And the great thing about writing sestinas is that there are no restrictions on what you choose for your end words. They could be nouns, adjectives, verbs, they could be names, places. You could even choose a number as one of your end words. No restrictions there. Because these end words are the fundamental part of sestina, we're going to spend a fair amount of time in today's workshop trying to brainstorm some end words and select ones that will be easy and interesting for you to use. I'm going to give you some guidance and lead you through a couple of different steps to help you generate potential end words for your sestina. There are a lot of ways to approach writing a sestina, but really any sort of poem and form. One is to fulfill the requirements of the form first, and then choose the subject of your poem and really develop it creatively. The other is to pick the subject and do more creative drafting, and then fulfill the requirements of the form. Both of these approaches are totally legitimate, and usually when we're creating art, we use some combination of the two. We go into a poetic form with some idea maybe of what we want to write about, but then as we're developing our poem, our idea changes, our writing changes alongside the restrictions of the form. In this workshop, I'm going to lead you through a combination of both of these approaches, but I am going to ask you to choose a subject at the beginning. This is just so that we have a concept in mind, a core theme that we can begin to work with to get material down on the page. So perhaps you turned on this video already knowing what you want to write your sestina about, in which case, fantastic. But if you don't already have a subject in mind, I'm going to give you a little bit of time here just to choose a subject. And remember that with sestinas, there's no restriction on content, so the subject of your sestina can be literally anything you want. For my example poem in this workshop, I'm going to write my sestina about winter. So first step in the workshop, if you're writing along, pause in the next screen and choose the topic that you'd like to write your sestina about. Awesome. So now we've got our subject for our sestinas. And as I said, this will probably change and evolve over time. Hopefully it'll get more specific or more interesting or nuanced, but we're just trying to get ideas on the page at this point. The next stage of this, much like the next stage of writing any poem, is we're just going to start brainstorming ideas, brainstorming words and material that we could potentially use for our end words in our sestina. My general idea for the subject of my sestina is winter. So what I'm going to do just now is make a word map and brainstorm some words connected to winter that I might be able to use as end words. So I'm just sort of free associating at this point some of the things that I think about winter. It's the holidays, there's snow and hail and ice. You might light a fire in the hearth to stay warm, etc. So we're just free associating at this point and filling in our word maps. All right, your turn. So in this step, start a new page, set up a word map or whatever technique is most helpful to you in brainstorming ideas, and write down as many words as you can think of connected to your idea. All right, so now we have a lot of possible end words for our sestinas that are connected to our subject material. In this next step, I'm going to guide you through a different way of selecting end words, which is not to do with the content of your poem, not to do with the subject or the theme, but instead to do with finding words that are easier to use in a repeated context like a sestina. Remember that when you're writing a sestina, you need to repeat each of these end words 7 times throughout the course of the poem. So it's really helpful to select words here that can be used in a variety of contexts and can be repeated in different ways without getting dull or just saying the same thing over and over again. So to that end, I have a couple of tips to help you select some end words that are going to keep your sestina fresh and interesting. So first, as I've mentioned in a couple of my other workshops, in poetry, the end of a sentence doesn't need to be the end of a line, and vice versa. So a single sentence can spill over multiple lines of poetry. That's totally fine. And that's helpful to remember for a sestina because it means that the words that you choose for your line endings can be words that you couldn't use for the end of a sentence. For example, you may have had a teacher tell you, don't end a sentence with a preposition. So, she ran after isn't a sentence because what is she running after? Whereas she ran after the bus is a full sentence. But because a single sentence can spill over multiple lines in a sestina or any poem, your line could end with the phrase, she ran after, and then the next line of poetry could start with the bus. So it's totally fine to choose as one of your end words a word that you normally couldn't end a sentence with. Secondly, and probably my biggest tip for choosing the end words for your sestina, is that you can make your life so much easier and make your poem so much more interesting by choosing as some of your end words homonyms, homographs, and homophones. Basically, this means choosing words that sound the same and or are spelled the same but have different meanings. I'm going to quickly go over what these words mean here and what some examples are, and then I'm going to give you a chance to try it out yourself. First, homonyms are words that are spelled and pronounced the same but that have different meanings. So lie is a homonym because it means both to lie down and to tell a falsehood, but both are pronounced and spelled the same. Secondly, homophones are words that are pronounced the same but spelled differently, with different meanings for each spelling. So one and one are homophones. The different spellings of the words have different meanings, with WON meaning a victory and ONE meaning a single thing, but we say them the same way, one. Third and finally, there are homographs, which are words that are spelled the same way but pronounced differently, with different meanings for each pronunciation. For example, minute and minute are homographs. A minute is 60 seconds, while minute is small, but they're spelled the same. Okay, why am I telling you all of this in a workshop on sestinas? Because if you choose as one of your end words, or multiple of your end words, a homonym, homophone, or homograph, you open up your possibilities. It means that you're not just stuck with a single word with a single meaning that you have to figure out 7 different ways of using. You open up your chances because there are now multiple different kinds of words, multiple different possible spellings or interpretations or meanings or pronunciations that you can then use. So in our prompt to Greg Crosby and Paul Case for their return to form sestinas, we asked them to use as some of their end words the homonyms point and mean, and the homophones right, ring, hour, and know. And as we saw when we looked at Paul's poem, he uses multiple versions of each of those words, which keeps the writing really fresh and interesting. So as we continue brainstorming possible words to use as the end words for your sestina, our next step is to write down some homonyms, homophones, and homographs that might be interesting and might fit well with the subject that you chose. So here I've started a new page for a bank of homonyms, homophones, and homographs. For each word that I find, I'm writing down all of the possible options that I can think of or that I can research. So I have sun and sun, I and I, not and not. And then I also have rose and rose and rose. I have tire and tire. So not all of these connect directly to my subject, which is winter, but I'm just trying to get down as many possibilities as I can possibly think of to give myself plenty of options. And again, you may not end up using any of these words as your end words for your sestina, and that's totally fine. There's definitely no requirement to use homonyms, homophones, and homographs in your end words. But here we're just trying to get a lot of options down on the page and also trying to think creatively about how the same word or the same spelling or pronunciation of a word can be used differently in different contexts to get us thinking about how we can repeat words but with different meanings. So go ahead now and create your bank of these words. You're more than welcome to copy some of the ones that I've written down if you'd like, and I've also linked in the video description below to a site where you can find more examples of homonyms, homophones, and homographs to draw upon. So go for it. Okay, third and final tip for generating possible end words for your sestina. You can get a little crafty here and choose as your end word a word that forms part of a larger word in order to use multiple options for your end words. This is a little untraditional. I'm not sure that Amo Danielle would approve, but it's a great way of getting innovative with language and giving yourself more choice in creating your sestina. So let me show you what I mean here. Let's say that you chose the word with as one of your end words. Keeping it simple, you could just, in one context, use the actual word with, but you could also use larger words that with is a part of, either as the ending or the beginning of those words. So you could use out with or forthwith at the end of your line, and it would still have with in the correct place. For example, you could use the line, "People still drink whiskey out with Scotland's borders." Or you could use within, without, or whither, and break the word across the lines. In this case, your next line begins with a partial word. For example, you could use, "The flowers wither on the vine." If you're a sestina traditionalist, you might be appalled at the fact that I'm even mentioning this possibility. So if that's you, go ahead and skip this step. You absolutely don't have to do this. But if you, like me, like to get a little bit funky with language, try out some different things, then in a moment, I'm going to ask you to write down a list of words that form part of larger words that you might be able to use as your end words for your sestina. So I've started a new page for this, and I'm just jotting down some of these words that form part of larger words. As I've said in my example, I have with, and I've also added in, forth, and can. And I realized while writing them down that forth and can also happen to be homophones and homonyms, respectively, so they are quite useful potential end words. Okay, if you're doing this step, go ahead now and jot down some of these words. So now we have 3 different lists of possible end words to use for your sestina. You have some words that connect to your subject material, you have some homonyms, homophones, and homographs, and you have some words that form part of larger words. Now that we have all of these potential words to choose from, it's time to go in and pick the 6 that we're going to use in writing our sestina. So what I'm going to ask you to do in the next step is comb through all of these lists and pick out the 6 words that you think are most interesting or that you think you could use in the most varying kinds of ways that might form a good spine of sorts for your poem. In my example, I'm going to choose at least one word from each category to use as my end words, but you absolutely do not have to do that. You can use all words about your subject or all homonyms or whatever. It is completely up to you. I'm going to start here with the words that I brainstormed about my subject. And you might realize, like I did, that some of the words that you brainstormed on your subject are actually also homonyms or parts of other words or otherwise fall into multiple categories. For example, chill was on my original list. And going over my words again, I realized that this works not only like cold, like chilly, but also like the phrase chill out, and also as part of the word wind chill. So because of all of these options, I ended up choosing chill as one of my end words, and I also chose dark and ice. And you'll notice here that whenever I'm writing down my end words, wherever they have multiple meanings, spellings, plurals, etc., I'm writing down all of the options on my end words list. After writing those 3 down, next I went to my list of homonyms, homophones, and homographs. And when you're choosing words from these lists, both the homonyms and also the partial words list, try to ensure that they're going to fit in okay with the subject of the poem that you've chosen. I'm really struck by this homonym, rose, rose, and rose. I love that it has multiple meanings and spellings that I could draw upon. And I also know that although most roses don't bloom in the winter, I think I could actually play on that idea in the poem. And I think I could also use the imagery of things rising, like it looked like frost rose out of the ground or something similar. so I'm going to include rose as one of my end words. I'm also including new off of my list of homophones, homonyms, and homographs, because I think that we often associate winter with endings, like the end of the year, plants dying, and it'd be really interesting to talk in my poem about the newness that happens in winter instead. So now I just have one end word left to choose, and I'm going to pick it from my partial words list, and I'm going with. And that's in part because there are a lot of different ways of using that word, as I demonstrated in my example earlier, but also because when I think about winter, I think about the holidays, and I think about gathering with people. So I think that using with as one of my repeating end words might help me to get this theme of community into my sestina. It is time for the next step, so go through your list, choose your 6 end words, and write them down on a new sheet of paper. Awesome, so now you have your end words, which are the spine of your poem, the heart of your sestina, right? And as I was saying before, poetry evolves as it meets restrictions. It is totally possible that as you're working with these end words, you might just get really frustrated with one and go, you know what? Not working, I'm going to pick a different one. So hang on to the list that you generated, as you might end up needing them later. But at least for now, we have some words that we can work with as we start to draft our poem. Before we get into all of that juicy creative writing, though, there is a little bit of tidying that we have to do. So, as I said at the beginning, sestinas follow this set pattern. It is always the same numbers in every sestina, other than the envoy, which changes a little bit depending on who you ask. But what I'm going to do is in the next 3 steps, I'm going to talk you through how to set up a roadmap for your sestina, which follows this pattern. And once we've done that, you don't have to think about numbers anymore. So we're going to do all of that just now, so buckle in, get ready for some numbers, it'll be over soon. First step here, super easy. We're just going to number your end words 1 through 6. This creates your sort of master key for your sestina, and it will determine the order in which these words appear throughout your poem. So I'm just going to the page where I've written out my end words, and I'm numbering them 1 through 6. And you can change the order of them here, but honestly, it's not going to matter a huge amount. The order that they appear in each stanza will be jumbled up throughout the poem anyway. All right, go for it and number those end words. All right, now that we have that key all set up, it's time to map out the poem. So I'm going to show you first in my example how to set up this roadmap. And there's going to be a lot of numbers and everything. Don't worry about copying everything down. In the next pause screen with the step on it, I'm going to have the code for you so that you know what to do. So just watch as I go through this example here. Okay, so you're going to need a couple of pages in your notebook for this if you're writing it with a pen and paper. The first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to number out the lines on the left-hand side of my page. There are 39 lines in a sestina, so 6 stanzas of 6 lines each, plus a 3-line envoy at the end. And you can see here, I'm dividing these up into their stanzas as I go and numbering the stanzas. So it's really clear to me as I'm drafting what point I'm at in my poem. Now onto the right-hand side of the page. I'm going to use a different color marker here, and I'm going to write out the number key for each stanza, following the specific order that you have to use in a sestina for the end words. So the first stanza, super easy. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The code for the second stanza is 6, 1, 5, 2, 4, 3. For the third stanza, we have 3, 6, 4, 1, 2, 5. And I just keep filling in the pattern down from there. For the envoy, the 3-line stanza at the end of a sestina, I'm dividing my lines in half and putting the numbers in the middle of the line, since that's where the words will need to fall. Okay, now it's your turn. So up in the next screen, I'm going to have that code, that pattern that you need to follow for your end words. Take as long as you need and write out your roadmap for your sestina. Okay, that was a lot of numbers. I promise we're almost there. So the third and final step in setting up your roadmap is simply adding the end words that you wrote in your key into the corresponding correct locations in your roadmap. And I'm going to show you in my example again here. So first I'm going to go back to my key where I've numbered all of my end words 1 through 6. Then beginning with word 1, I'm going to put these words into my roadmap in the correct places. Everywhere I have 1 in my map, I'm going to write the correct end word. So in my example, that's chill. After I've done all of the number 1s, I'm going to go back to my key, remind myself what my number 2 word is. It's dark. And then I'm going to put that everywhere that my map has a 2. And then I'm just going to keep doing that for words 3, 4, 5, and 6. And if some of your words or all of your words have multiple options, like they're homonyms or parts of larger words or could be pluralized, you can either write down all of the options at the end of the line small, or you can just write down one version of it. If you do the former, that shows you all of the options as you're drafting, but it can also get a little bit cluttered. So for me, I've just written down one version of each of my words. For instance, I just have rose as R-O-S-E, rather than writing out the alternate spelling R-O-W-S. But as I'm drafting, I'll constantly be referencing my word key to consider all of the options for how I might use that end word. All right, final step in setting up our roadmap, use your key and add those words into your roadmap. If you took my workshop on the Shakespearean sonnet, which you can also find again just here, you'll remember that we made a rhyme map. And what I said there was you're probably going to go through a ton of different versions of this rhyme map because it'll get messy as you're drafting and you're going to want to try new things. Exactly the same is the case here. You might get to a point where, as I said, you want to swap out an end word, or you've just gone through so many drafts of a particular stanza that you just need a clean slate. That is totally fine. So anytime that you need to, you can just create a new roadmap for your Sestina using the instructions that I provided. All right, now that we have all of that structural stuff out of the way, it's time to really get creative. And the great thing about Sestinas is that there are no other restrictions. So we've done the organizational work. We've done the work of picking our end words and putting them in the right places. From now on, much of the process of writing a Sestina is like writing any other poem. It's a bit like putting together a puzzle, figuring out how to use these end words, but it's really fun and imaginative. So we're going to start that process now. For this next step, we're going to spend some time drafting phrases and various material around these 6 end words. And because they're used 7 different times throughout the poem, it's important to spend a little while on this step and really dig into these words and think about all of the different contexts and ways in which they can be used. So for this step, I'm starting a new page for each of my end words so that I have plenty of room to brainstorm phrases around them. And for the words that have multiple options, the homophones, words that form parts of larger words, words with plurals, etc., I'm writing out all of their possibilities at the top of the page. Then I'm just going to start writing out as many phrases and sentences, as many images and lines as I can possibly think of that incorporate these words. And as I'm writing, I have my core concept for my poem in the forefront of my mind. My Sestina is about winter. So when, for example, I'm drafting phrases around my end word dark, I'm constantly thinking, okay, how do we associate the concepts of darkness and winter? So I have phrases including the dark nights lengthen, the darkest time of year, we lit up the dark streets with Christmas lights, and other phrases like that, which all connect my end word with my core concept. And don't worry as you're drafting this material about how anything will fit together, whether there's a narrative or anything like that. At this point, we're just getting material out there that we can play with later. While drafting these phrases, you can really let your imagination loose. Think creatively about how these end words can be used. So, for example here, in my page using rose or roses, I have multiple contexts, multiple meanings. So I have rose like to rise with the phrase heat rose from the ground, melting the snow. I also have rose like the flower. So I have the rose bushes were bare and thorny. And then finally, the third context of rose, I have rose like lines. So the phrase rows of stockings over the fire. And obviously, rose is a wonderfully suggestive word with lots of great descriptive phrases, particularly around, the flower, roses. This coming up with descriptions can be a little bit more challenging with words like new or with, words that are more general connecting words. So if you have any of those sorts of words on your end word list for your sestina, try to brainstorm broader phrases that incorporate these words but are about your theme. So for example, I have with as one of my end words. So I have phrases like, I build snowmen with my family. The leaves wither on the tree. I ran out without my coat. A final thing to consider in this brainstorming, as you have all of these words in your head, you might think of phrases that incorporate more than one of your end words. For instance, I came up with the phrase roses gilded with ice, which uses both rose and ice. Keep these. They're really helpful in considering how your end words connect with each other, and they're particularly helpful as you're writing your envoy. More on that later. Okay, your turn. Take as much time as you need for this step and write down as many phrases, sentences, images, bits of description as you can possibly think of incorporating your end words. You're going to need at least 7 different ways of using each word, so try to write at least 7 ideas per word. Okay, hopefully that went well and you now have plenty of material that you could possibly use in starting to write your sestina. This next part of the creative process of writing a sestina is not unlike stitching together a quilt. We have a lot of pieces that we've made, so like squares of fabric when you're making a quilt, right? And we know where those pieces are meant to go. We know where our end words are meant to go because of our roadmap, and let's say we're following a pattern for our quilt. Now the only thing left to do is to actually sew them together in the most beautiful, most interesting way that you can think of. So a lot of how you approach this will just be down to your own creativity and the way that you prefer to write. I'm going to show you my personal approach in this example, and I'm just going to show you how I write my first stanza and talk you through the process. My first step in drafting my first stanza was to go back through the phrases that I'd drafted and work out which ones I might want to include here and how they might fit together. So I started with my first end word, chill. And I like this first phrase I drafted, a chill in the air. Obviously, you don't need to put your phrases into your sestina in any order or rely entirely on them at all, but that's just where I started. So I just drafted that down. We started feeling a chill in the air. And I left some space before it, just in case I wanted to start the poem with an additional phrase. Next, I moved on to my next end word, which is dark. Again here, I checked the phrases that I drafted for ideas that might fit into this line. I have a lot of material around the days getting dark in winter, and I wanted to incorporate that idea. I changed the wording somewhat to make this idea fit into the line. So now it reads, the days grew dark earlier. Then it was time for my third end word, ice. Again, I went back to my phrases. I really like the sound of black ice slicked the streets, particularly the assonance of ice and slicked. So I decided to use this concept of streets getting icy. Then I thought, okay, keeping with this narrative of it becoming winter, when do we first get icy streets? Where I grew up, that was around November, so I tinkered with the phrase and ended up with, one night in November, ice slicked over the roads. Plus here, I changed the words from streets to roads because I also wanted that assonance with rose at the end of this line. On to the fourth end word, rose. And here I'm really faced with multiple options, more so than in the first 3 words. I'm asking myself, what meaning of this word do I want to use in this stanza? So again, I went back to the phrases I'd brainstormed, and particularly here I considered which of these phrases, which meaning of rose would work best with the narrative I'm developing of the early stages of winter. I love this phrase, at dawn we rose to a frosted lawn. Both because of the rhyme of dawn and lawn, but also because it fits into the poem nicely. It evokes that first morning where you wake up to see that the season has changed. Transferring this into my stanza draft, I've adapted it a little bit. So first I tried, the next dawn we rose to snow coating our lawn. And then I decided that I wanted to use coating in a later line, so I changed the phrase to, the next dawn we rose to snow draped over our lawn. So I still have that rhyme of dawn and lawn, but I've changed frost to snow so that we also have the assonance of snow and rose, and also roads as well. And I've used draped because I love that imagery of snow draped over the lawn like a new layer. So now I'm down to my final two end words, new and with. And actually, new fits in perfectly here. I have this image of snow draped over the lawn. It's a new layer. And I think I want to use a metaphor here. What is applied in new layers? Paint. And I've also gone back to my phrases and seen the phrase, the ground newly coated in snow. And I love this assonance of coat and snow. So I incorporate all of these ideas and I draft the line, coating it in new glistening paint. Then my final line needs to end with. And I liked this phrase that I drafted. I ran out without a coat, and I want to include it here. So that means using with as part of a larger word, without, and dividing it across lines, and actually across stanzas here. But although that's kind of untraditional, I really like how that enjambment captures the energy, the rush of running outside without a coat for the first snow of the year. It's like the poem is so impatient, it can't even finish the line, it can't even finish the stanza properly. It has to get out to the next stanza. So, this is a way that I feel that the form of the poem actually really mirrors the content. Finally, I went back to the start of that first line, which I'd left unfinished, and I added in some context, added in a time setting for the poem, by mid-autumn. So my first draft of my first stanza reads, by mid-autumn, we started feeling a chill in the air. The days grew dark earlier, and one night in November, ice slicked over the roads. The next dawn, we rose to snow draped over the lawn, a fresh coat of new, glistening paint. I ran out without my coat. So that was my approach to creating the first stanza of my Sestina. You might have a totally different creative process, in which case use whatever strategies you feel most comfortable with in drafting your poem. In the next step, I'm going to give you some time to pause the video and take as much time as you need to try to stitch together these end words to create your first stanza. Just remember, this is your first draft. This might be your first time trying a Sestina, so give yourself plenty of time and be patient with yourself. You got this. Hopefully that went well for you, and hopefully you now have a first draft of your first stanza of your Sestina. If that took a while, or if it was kind of a mess, or if you're not really happy with what you came up with, that is totally fine too. Just like any process of creative writing or creation more generally, it takes a lot of trial and error and it takes a lot of practice, so just be patient with yourself. The rest of the process of creating your Sestina is effectively just repeating those last steps with your remaining stanza. So you're going to use some of the phrases, some of the material and ideas that you drafted, you're going to stitch them together, and you're going to keep playing around until you have, maybe it's a narrative, maybe it's some sort of theme, whatever it is, until your poem starts to emerge. So in this video, I'm not going to guide you specifically through the process of writing stanzas 2 through 6 because it is effectively the same steps, but I am going to talk you through the process of writing your envoy, which is that 3-line stanza at the very end. And that's because it's a bit tighter, it's more condensed, you have to use all 6 words in 3 lines, so it can be a little bit tricky and there's some different strategies that you can use for it. So earlier, when I was talking you through the process of drafting phrases incorporating your end words, I suggested that you hold on to any phrases which used multiple end words, as they might be particularly helpful in writing your envoy. So for example, I had the phrase, roses gilded in ice. As I approached drafting my envoy, having this phrase was really useful because, as I said, envoys use all of your end words in a more condensed format. So it's helpful if you have phrases already drafted which connect these end words in a concise manner. So I actually started drafting my envoy using that phrase, which meant that I began halfway through. But because of how my end words were placed, rose and ice weren't right next to each other. There was new right in the middle. So I had to think, okay, how can I incorporate new into the middle of that phrase? I played with it for a bit, and eventually I came up with the phrase, "The roses are all newly gilded in ice." So that was half of my envoy done. Then I kept working backwards from there, building up from the ending. The next word, the third word that I had to use, was chill. In my envoy, I wanted to keep with this idea of it just turning to winter, so it'd be getting increasingly cold. So I came up with the phrase, rising chill. And now it's just down to finishing that first line. Now that I had rising chill, I kind of wanted to parallel that. So I had to use dark, and I thought, well, if the chill is rising, what could the dark be doing? And you might be able to tell I really like alliteration, so I said the descending dark. Finally, I was down to my last word, with. I spoke the material I had drafted out loud a couple of times. I considered the different ways of using with. I considered the narrative in the poem of the onset of winter. And finally, I ended up with the phrase, "and we feel within the descending dark." I really like the meter of that, how it flows. So the first draft of my envoy reads, "And we feel within the descending dark the rising chill, and the roses are all newly gilded in ice." So at this point in the workshop, you've only got your first stanza drafted. And for some of you, you might be thinking, okay, I don't want to write my envoy now. So if that's the case, skip this next step and just keep developing stanzas 2 through 6, and then you can write your envoy at the end. But if you would prefer to write your envoy now and just apply the guidance that I've just given you, pause at this next screen, take as much time as you need, and write your envoy. All right, so at this point, you have all of the tools that you need to continue developing and editing your Sestina. You've got plenty of end words, and you've already selected your 6 and put them into your roadmap. You have lots of phrases, materials, ideas drafted around those end words, and you already have your first stanza and possibly your envoy already written. All that remains in this workshop is for me to give you some final guidance on how to continue drafting and then eventually editing your Sestina, and then I'm going to wrap up this video and let you go off and develop it. My first tip here is one that I've said pretty constantly throughout this workshop, but I do think that it bears repeating. The joy, the fun part, the creative aspect of writing Sestina is figuring out as many ways as possible of using the same words, but in interesting and changing contexts. So really lean into that challenge. If you have a word like rose, don't just use the flower again and again, right? Use it in all of these different contexts. If you have a homonym, a homophone, or a homograph, if you have a partial word, if you have a word that can be pluralized, whatever the case may be, really have fun with it and lean into the creativity. And I'm saying this not only to make it more fun for you as the writer, but because using strategies like this keeps Sestinas more interesting for the reader. Because they're not just saying, okay, I know it's the same words again and again, but they're saying, I wonder how they're going to change it in the next stanza. I wonder if they're going to use a slightly different word. What's going to happen here? So using things like puns, even if it's not a particularly funny poem, playing with your language is a way for you to be creative and a way for you to keep your reader on the edge of their seat. Secondly, like with all poetry, like with all creative material, absolutely nothing is set in stone until you are happy with your poem and you consider it to be finished. So it might be the case that you are working on your Sestina and one of your end words is just being an absolute nightmare. You cannot figure out how to make it work with the rest of your words. You're not married to that word. You can always swap it out, even if it's at the very end. That might make life a little bit trickier for you, but if ultimately changing it is going to make it easier in the long run, change it out. You have full control over this. So just because you've set up your roadmap does not mean that that is set in stone. Do whatever you need to do to write the best poem that you can write. And that is all of my guidance given. I'm going to wrap up the video here and let you continue working on your Sestina following this workshop. If you are comfortable sharing your Sestina with us or any of the poems that you created through these workshops, please do drop them in the comments section below. I would absolutely love to read them. And as always, if you have any questions about poetic form, any of the forms that we discussed in this series, please drop them below and I will answer them. If you enjoyed this workshop, please do like this video and subscribe to our channel. It really, really helps us to make more of these. And please do share it with a pal. A fun challenge would be pick the same end words and see how totally different your sestinas end up being. You can watch the rest of the workshops in our Return to Form series at this playlist, and you can watch all of the fantastic poems created through this series at this playlist. Thank you so much, guys, and happy writing!